Hello there, I'm K-Ball, and welcome to Human Skills, where I interview tech industry leaders about all the non technical skills that go into success in the tech industry. Amy Chantasirivisal is someone I've been chatting back and forth with online for a couple of years now. She's one of those engineering leaders who tackles the human problems head on, building high trust, high impact teams, such as the one she's now building at Hint Health. This was such an interesting and ranging conversation. We talked about the trade offs of different business funding models, how those play out into management choices. We dove deep into the knotty challenges that managers face navigating supporting their reports through various ups and downs. But more than anything, we talked about values, how they drive our work, and how high level values get operationalized into day to day work. Please enjoy this conversation with Amy Chantasirivisal. Amy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to get to talk with you. I feel like we've exchanged notes quite a bit on what was Twitter and now LinkedIn, but this is our first big conversation. So I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah,
Uh,
likewise. I feel like we've been circling the same social circles for quite some time, and I'm glad to finally be able to chat with you live.
Absolutely. So maybe let's start. Can you introduce yourself and your background and how you came to care about these things that I've been calling human skills?
Absolutely. So my name is Amy Chantasirivisal. I am currently the Senior Director of Engineering at a small health tech company called Hint Health. I have taken a long and meandering way towards this particular role. I started out my career as a front end engineer, entirely self taught. I did environmental biology in university, so not anything related to computers. And then I kind of fell into my first role doing front end development because it was a hobby of mine in high school and through college. And then I realized after I graduated that I couldn't do much with my with my degree in environmental sciences at that time because this was quite a while ago, and there was not quite that green tech movement yet, and so I didn't have a lot of career options, and I fell back on this hobby which I really loved, and turns out that people make careers out of. And so I spent a few years as a front end engineer at various startups, a lot of like consumer retail types of companies, and then selfishly uh, fell into management as well as a result of, and I say selfishly because I had kind of initially set out to solve this problem of why is it so hard to get my code into production? Why is it so frustrating? Why are all my teammates, why are we venting to each other? Why, how can we make this process better? And so through the tried and true method of getting into management through project management and becoming Scrum Master for my team, that's how I fell into people management. I spent a good number of years doing people management best practices, and over the course of that time, developed my own, let's say, my own gripes and kind of poked my own holes at some of the common practices that were causing me and my team members to burn out. And so I had gone from different startups to try to figure out how do I do this management thing in a way that feels authentic and fair and safe and sustainable. And it turns out that by and large, the startup world was not super conducive towards this. And
Yes.
so, long story, maybe a little bit shorter. I ended up at a smaller privately owned company that was completely bootstrapped, so no VC money. Was building their own software, growing at a sustainable pace, and then that's where I learned a lot about really like remote work before COVID. I learned about what it meant to do asynchronous communication, what it meant to be thoughtful about growing your team and hiring towards your values and things like that. But ultimately, because it was a kind of like a privately owned company, the pace wasn't quite matching what I really enjoyed. So I do like some of that startup chaos, and so I decided to come back to the startup world and basically marry a lot of what I learned in between that job and a bunch of my own sort of like personal revelations, right? And to do that, in a way that scales at a small, fast-paced company. So here I am.
Yeah. Oh man, so many different threads we could go into there. But first I've got to ask, how is it working coming back in the startup world and trying to deal with the pressures that come from the funding model while also trying to be human?
Yeah, there's definitely, I think, a conflict of interest at times there. The company that I'm at right now, Hint Health, we are actually private equity funded, which is a first for me because I had been at venture-backed companies prior to this. And I would say that it's definitely got some of the better balances in place, right? And that growth is still something that we strive for, but it's not growth at all costs. And so I do get a lot of leeway to sometimes make decisions that might cause us to go slower in the short term, but to allow us to scale and grow more sustainably for the long term, right? Which is what the PE investors are primarily looking for. They're not looking for the next unicorn. They're looking for a sustainable business, which is actually a really nice change of pace, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. It might be worth actually going through what some of those concrete trade offs that you end up making there, because one of the steps towards being able to make those trade offs is awareness that they exist. And then we can sort of maybe flesh out a little bit how one might apply that in a venture backed or like a VC backed environment where the pressures are different.
Sure. One of the biggest things that I learned early on about the VC startup world is the throwing money and people at a problem. And that has been actually a source of actually a lot of startups that I've been at really struggling later down the road. Because, for example, if CS is bombarded, right, with a lot of issues, customers are reporting bugs or something like that. In the VC model, I was very accustomed to let's just hire more CS people and worry about the actual root cause of these issues later, which down the line ends up becoming, well, because we took shortcuts when we architected the system, or we chose not to fix bugs and instead ship more features, right? And so that whole going fast and just kind of throwing more bodies or more money at a problem definitely comes to bite you later on, I would say more often than not, right? And so part of the intentional growth that I seek to bring into my teams is to have that conversation around what is the actual cause of the issue that we're trying to fix, and can that actually be fixed by us rethinking our methodology, changing our processes, taking a step back, and maybe delaying something on the roadmap if it means that later down the line we don't have a headache from skipping this one like maintenance task that really needs to be addressed.
Totally. What this is highlighting to me is, just as in engineering, all of these kind of higher level decisions have trade offs associated with them.
Absolutely.
And uh, one model is always take the approach that, is just throw more resources at it. Um, Other models, yeah, may involve delaying different things or trading things off. Do you have a kind of framework for how you guide those conversations or kind of make decisions around those trade offs?
There's I would say there's a lot of constraints management in those discussions, right? And so I wouldn't say that there's a tried and true formula or anything like that that I think about as I'm helping to guide teams through these types of decisions. But there are, I would say, different vectors or different aspects of the problem that I would look at as a result of these conversations. And so it would be things like, what is the current business priority, right? And then almost like doing like a pros and cons list of, if we took this route and did things according to this scenario, what is the possible and probable outcome versus the other route? And then considering, okay, the business priorities, what do individual team members actually want to do, or what do they feel strongly about potentially is like the right or the better thing to do, right? Does this align with maybe a longer term strategic thing that we're trying to do? So, for example, the decision between, I don't know, let's just say like doing some optimizations for automation or something, automated systems, whether it's like automated testing or maybe automating some deployment stuff that the team wants to do. The trade-offs there are, what's the opportunity cost, right? If we spend this time now, what do we potentially miss out on, and are we okay with that? Is that worth the cost now? And so it's really about balancing a bunch of those different kinds of constraints for sure.
Yeah. Okay. I want to come back now to something that you mentioned as a part of your intro, and you talked about hiring towards values. Can you flesh that out and explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. The thing that has come out of my experiences in my career is that when I'm job searching, the first branding experience that you get from any company is a corporate website, right? And you go to the about page, and it says all these great things about the team and the company and what they care about. And so then you go through the interview process and you join, and then the actual experience is not anything like what is advertised on the website. They just had a really good marketing team or something along those lines. Or maybe it's just what they put on their website, to be more charitable, right, is more aspirational than what is actually there in practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I say hiring to values, I really mean making sure that the culture that you have as a team internally is represented accurately with what is on your external branding, whether that's your company about page or how you show up to an interview with a candidate, how you respect or don't respect a candidate's time, right? Whether or not you're being transparent about the interview process and what are the steps and what to expect and things like that. And so that's what I mean by hiring to values.
Got it. Yeah, it's funny. I recently went through interviewing looking for a new job, and one of my questions for everyone when I talk to them is, okay, how do your values show up in your day to day?
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell very
Absolutely.
quickly. Some people are like, oh, yes, let me tell you. And they'll go into a bunch of stuff. And other people are like, huh, that's a
Yeah.
good
What are our
question.
values again?
Exactly. I'm actually curious how you think about the role of values in other parts of work beyond hiring.
Yeah, it is something that I think about a lot, and in fact, am having many conversations with my team members about this right now, right? Which is for I think for the purposes of building trust within a team and building credibility between leadership and and people who are actually executing on the leader's plans, right, is that that feeling of authenticity, right? So do the values reflect the behaviors? And so I'm having a lot of conversations right now, for example, around, right, so what are our values and how does it actually show up in day-to-day work? How does that show all the way up in how an engineer does a pull request comment, right? How does that show up in the way that people respond in Slack messages? And you would think that some big grand values list that's on a marketing website doesn't have anything to do with that, but it really does, right? And so for me, it ends up becoming this thing that I do on many of the teams that I've joined in the past is to, take the company values. One, do kind of like a gut check with people to see if like these values actually resonate with them and with how they work. And then two, actually start to codify a lot of that in terms of how do these values then get translated into practices, team norms, behaviors, and the way that we actually work together to make that more concrete, because everyone's interpretation of company values or even like personal values can be very different depending on who you ask, what their background is, how they were raised, and what culture they grew up in, and all those sorts of things, right? And so there's so many ways to interpret this big broad value statement that it's really beneficial to get into the nitty gritty details of what that actually means.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any particular examples where we can follow a thread straight through from high level value statement to, for example, how it shows up in a PR?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me think about which value I want to pick out from our current list. So we have we have one value around learning, right? Always be learning, and that also coincides with, I think, a value that we also have around caring deeply about each other. And so those two things are really important, and they can show up in PRs, for example. So what does it mean to care deeply? What does it mean to value learning? And so when an engineer goes in to look at someone else's PR, that's an opportunity to potentially teach someone something or to share knowledge that you as a person may have that this person may not, right? But then to care about someone means to be able to share that knowledge in a way where it's not to nitpick, it's not to deride or demean someone for like not knowing a thing, but it's really like, hey, on this line, I saw that you wrote X, Y, and Z, and perhaps a better way to do it would be ABC, right? And in an effort to help you grow your own skills. And so to just approach those PRs with like a kindness, right? And to come at it with the
Hmm.
intent of helping someone want to help someone grow their career, I think is how something like that, like those two values can trickle down into, let's just say, a PR comment.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's interesting too as we look at these very micro level interactions like that, the ways they bubble up into a broader culture. I think I've encountered situations where people don't think about the ways that their phrasing or their willingness to kind of put things in a way that doesn't assign blame
Hmm.
impact other people around them. I'm
Absolutely.
curious what other aspects or what are the various aspects you look for in a team culture as you're trying to craft an environment that is safe and open for people to learn and grow.
Yeah, I love that you bring that one up because that one is, I would say, kind of a double-edged sword in some ways, right? Where the words that you use to communicate are definitely important and they convey a certain connotation, right? Depending on the words that you choose. But also knowing that I myself have worked with a bunch of folks who are part of the neurodiverse community. I myself have ADHD, and so have oftentimes stumbled on my own words or picked a bad set of words to use in conversation or in comments, and so sometimes the impact was not to the intention, and so there is that aspect of it of some folks are more aware of the words that they choose and some are not, but
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, to your question of other things that I look for in a team, is that openness to challenge your biases, to challenge your worldview, to maybe consider that, yeah, this thing that you maybe took offense to was not actually made, mentioned to offend, but more it was a communication difference or a difference in perspective of maybe someone is more indirect and someone is more direct, and sometimes those styles can collide, but that doesn't mean that one person's an asshole or not, but it's more just like there's a difference that hasn't been acknowledged and hasn't been talked about, right? And sometimes, for me, psychological safety within the team really has comes down to being able to reflect on those things for yourself to determine what's the story in my head versus what actually happens, right? So that then you can meet your team member where they need to be met.
Yeah. Well, I love something you said there, which is that, highlighting the our differences and assumptions.
Yeah,
And one of the key things to me that you kind of drew out there is to be safe doesn't mean we don't have those differences, but it means that we can talk about them and we can
yeah,
address them and we can say, hey, when you said this thing, I took it to mean this and that bothered me. Like, can we
right.
discuss that? And the result might be that you change the way you say it, or it might be that I change the way I understand you when you say things. But we're having
Yep,
that meta level conversation.
absolutely. And it's something that I would say that most teams have not really been faced they haven't had to face that as a team, right? And I feel like that is something that is somewhat unique that I bring to the teams that I manage, which is that meta introspection of, what is the assumption, what is the actual intent, and like, have you had a conversation, have you given the feedback, and then to kind of draw a little bit on, on my like Brene Brown, right? Like, have you made yourself vulnerable to that, right? Have you allowed yourself to be vulnerable with a teammate to actually resolve some of these points of friction that might come up?
When that vulnerability is hard,
It is.
do
It's
you
incredibly hard.
have do you have any approaches that you recommend or that you teach to your teams to kind of open up to the pain that that vulnerability also brings in?
Well, that's a hard one, I would say. Some teams uh, have been harder than others. I would say that there, at a minimum, it has to be a couple of people on the team, maybe not even everyone, but at least a couple people who believe in the work, believe in the team, believe in what they're doing enough to want to participate, right? Because it has to start with a small group of people, and it can't just start with a leader, right? Because then that becomes a mandate from the top down, and that's not particularly effective in my opinion. And so it has to be at least a couple people on the team who are willing to engage in that way, and then ultimately start to model some of that in front of folks, right? And I have done it to some degree, to some success, but as someone who is in a position of power, right, it doesn't always land quite the same. But I always try to be pretty open about, hey, today I'm struggling, today I'm having like a bad ADHD brain day, stuff like that, right? Like I'm just not at my best, and just being able to share that, I myself don't have the answers all the time, and I don't know things, and just being able to model that a little bit, at least can help start to change maybe some of like those mindsets, or maybe even some of the fear on certain teams where folks don't want to share because they don't know if it's safe to.
Yeah. So something you said there gives me another angle I'd be curious to go down. So you highlighted that some of this can't come from the top.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think there are some types of changes that often can only come from the top. How do
Mm-hmm.
you assess, here's a cultural situation or here's a thing going on. What approach is going to be effective to tackle that?
That's a good question. As I think about it, in my experience, I have leaned towards the answer to that being more situational than anything. And that really just has to do with who's at the top, right? Do they already have the trust of the team or not? Do people find those leaders to be authentic, right? Because depending on what those leaders look like and how they're perceived by the team, I think it requires different tactics, I suppose. In sort of the best scenario where there has been a lot of trust and maybe the team has just grown kind of fast and hasn't adjusted, right? And so like the good feelings are kind of all still there, and it's more like growing pains are hard. Those are the ideal situations, right? Because you don't have to undo the mistrust or the distrust before you move forward with the whole, all right, let's make some potential cultural changes. And I think top down in those senses, or in that scenario, could work, right? But where there's already like a lot of active mistrust or just not a lot of faith in leadership, then I feel like that has to be more bottoms up. Yeah, I think that's been my experience. That tracks pretty closely to my experience.
Got it. So to make sure I'm understanding correctly, uh, if you have a good well of trust between leadership and the folks in the organization, then leadership is more able to lead
Yeah.
changes from
Hmm.
themselves. And if you do not have a well of trust, those changes will just be met with resistance. They're not going to work. They're not
Yeah.
going to go through.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. Okay. I'd love to at this point go in a slightly different direction. One of the things that we have kind of chatted past each other online, I think, a little bit around is about career development and how there are many different ways to a career. I mean, you highlighted in your introduction, you were self taught. You came out of an environmental biology background. I am also self taught. I came out of a physics background. I think many people, one of the beautiful things about the tech industry is how many people have been able to get into it from non
Absolutely.
traditional routes. But it does mean that the sort of classic go, get your CS degree, go to a big tech company, work your way up doesn't work for a lot of people. And honestly, like even for many people that it could work for, it might not be the best option. So I'd kind of like to just start with getting your sense of how you think about career development, maybe both for yourself and then also as you're coaching reports through things.
Yeah, it's something that I am incredibly excited about, just in general, just working on, continuing to iterate on, because I've had many ideas, and inspired by a lot of folks who have done much of this thinking before me. But I've had a lot of ideas over the years of like how to do this the quote unquote right way, or maybe like a better way that accounts for these individual differences and the different ways that you could become an engineer. And ultimately, I very much do believe, given my own background and yours and others like us, right, that there's no linear path through this career. I mean, there are maybe more typical paths, especially when you get into bigger companies, but especially for someone like myself who's been in the startup world for, I don't know, what has it been now? Like 17 years. There's no such thing as linear in software development. And so for me, the way that I think about career development is to really have coach folks to lean into what they're good at, right? Because I have had really great senior engineers who maybe are not the best technically, but can run a project on time with like all, like not even just like the requirements, but also like bells and whistles and things too, right? And then everyone doesn't feel burned out at the end. And there's some, senior engineers who can just do that. And there are others who would fail miserably at, keeping a project on the rails, but can architect their way out of a box blindfolded and handcuffed behind their back, right? And so I think that there's a lot of different ways to excel. And so for me, when I'm thinking about career ladders and things like that, they can be helpful because you're making the assessment criteria for like promotions and salary increases and things like that explicit, right? And that is very important from an equity perspective. But they're also rigid because they end up being checklists for people to, knock off, like, okay, I did X, Y, and Z. Now can I get a promotion, right? And so the way that I really think about it is the career matrix that that we've seen so often is really the minimum set of requirements. But then there could be a whole bunch of different things that when we talk about T-shaped people in software or just in general, right? You can be a generalist with certain specialties. That specialty doesn't have to be a technical specialty. It could be project management. It could be actually, forming relationships and building trust amongst teammates and stakeholders and people external to your org. And maybe that means that if you have, like a specialty in one or both of those like project and people things, maybe management is a good track for you and you should lean into that, right? And see for yourself like whether that is something that would be fulfilling. And so when I have conversations around career development, that's kind of what I'm trying to hone in on, of like what actually brings you joy in your day-to-day work. What do you wish that you could be doing more of? And then let's find ways for you to do that, and to practice those skills to see if you truly do love them as much as you think you do, or if it's just because of like the novelty of these things, right? And then from there, the promotion or the change in role or responsibilities really comes down to, all right, what's the minimum requirement for these roles, and have we satisfied all those things? But then what are like those, I don't know, for lack of a better word, what are those add-ons to the role that then kind of shape you into the process-oriented senior engineer, the people-oriented senior engineer, or like the more technical-oriented senior engineer? And I think all of those are valid ways to, you know, be an engineer.
Totally. Yeah, I love this. And it ties into something that I've been thinking about a lot, which is, and it I think includes a lot of your minimum pieces, right? People will post a role and they'll have some expectations, or you'll get a new job and it'll have your expectations, and those are fine and good, and you need to deliver on what you're being hired to do. But that's not the interesting part, right?
It really isn't.
Your role is something that, to my mind, is a co-creation exercise, right? It's something that
Hmm.
you are co-creating with your manager, with your peers, with your stakeholders, of like, how do I fit in this complex environment that we call a team, and
Absolutely.
what is the way in which I am going to, bring my uniqueness to that and create
Right.
extra value.
Yes. And there's this kind of notion when you have like these rigid, career matrices and frameworks, right? That they become checklists, but then they also attempt to create all these engineers who are the same, right? And we know that people are so different and bring so many unique things, and yet these frameworks are so rigid and are selecting for sameness. And so ultimately, the other thing that I think about as I'm doing hiring and actual team formation is, yeah, how do all these people actually fit together? Right? If you have a team full of very technically minded engineers and no one who cares about process or no one who cares about people and relationships, you're going to have some like major dysfunctions in that team, right? And so how do you balance that out? How do you look at the team holistically, and how do you ensure that the team as a whole is succeeding and not just as like individuals, checking off requirements on a career framework?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this gets to a conversation that I was just having with someone else on one of these podcasts, but the metaphors that we use to describe our organizations and our teams and our people matter. And there's one that I am on a campaign around, so I'm going to raise it again, which is, there's a tendency for business folks and business speak to talk about people as resources. You say,
Hmm.
oh, we need to throw some more engineering resources at this, or do we need more design resources? And the problem with this, well, is manyfold. But and I think there's like a respect and a humanizing problem with it, but it's also just an inaccurate model, because it leads you to thinking that people are fungible, and it doesn't matter if it's this person or that person. I just need somebody to throw at this problem.
Right.
Uh,
Anybody will do, right?
yeah, and it doesn't
No.
work.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. It definitely doesn't work that way. And there's been like your research on it, right? And the whole mythical man month thing and all of that. And it just, adding more people to the mix sometimes does not actually solve the problem. And you have to actually dissect the problem to the point where you actually understand what it is you're trying to solve for, right? Is it purely capacity to write code? Or is it the fact that nothing gets done because everything is disorganized? That's like a different problem to solve, right? Or is nothing getting done because everyone hates each other? That could be a thing too, right? And so really getting to the root of a problem, and then formulating a plan based off of that, I feel like is a skill that not a lot of managers have been supported or encouraged to do, especially in startups, right? Because you got to move fast, you got to deliver the thing, and so there's no time for that introspection. And in fact, it like feels, it feels wrong to sit and think. That it feels like you're not being productive when you just sit and think, right? And that's something that I had to unlearn for myself as well, to just come to accept that sometimes thinking is what you need to do to actually solve problems.
Yes. Well, and this plays into so many things, right? For engineers as well. There's this
Yes.
idea, oh, if your hands aren't on the keyboard, you're not being productive.
Yes.
I cannot tell you how many problems I have been stuck sitting in front of a keyboard, could not solve, and then I go for a walk and that comes to me.
Exactly. Exactly. And one thing that I've been appreciating about the shift to remote work for the organizations that are really committing to it, right, is that schedules have gotten a lot more flexible, right? So if you do need to take that walk midday, go for it, right? If you need to just like sign off during lunch for a couple hours because exercise is good for your mental health, you can do that, right? Whereas I think it was a lot harder for people to do that when they were having to go into an office and commute and all those things. And so I do think that remote work can help make space for that type of creative thinking and problem solving, right? But simultaneously, we as workers, I suppose, have to unlearn and like shed that guilt of, oh, if my hands are not on a keyboard, I'm not actually productive or creating value.
So coming to this piece that you highlighted of, most managers have never learned or been taught how to get to the root of those knotty problems. How would you teach a new manager to approach that type of assessment?
In those situations, I found that one-on-one coaching has been most effective because sharing experiences, my own experiences, even like teaching, like actual putting like course material or something like that, or like a lesson together can be useful, but ultimately the lesson is much harder to have committed to memory if you don't practice it, right? And so I do a lot of coaching um, and sort of like problem solving with managers as things are coming up. And so that's what I spend a lot of one-on-one time for, if it's not for, their own individual career development, but just to coach them through certain issues that they're having on their teams, because I feel like that's where those those lessons or those like things that I could teach or impart on someone, that's where it really lands, is when they can actually see it applied and then actually see the results of it with someone they're managing.
Yeah. I'd love if we could find a way to make this more concrete. Do you have any stories or situations that would be safe to share?
Let me think about this. So I was working with, I had a person on my team previously, one of my previous teams that would miss meetings often. They just didn't have their eye on the clock and would like miss meetings, and obviously that reflected badly on them. Frustrated team members, right, and as well as managers. And there was one manager who was basically like, I think we need to fire this person, right? Like they don't have respect. They're not like showing up for meetings, like this and that. And I was like, okay, well, like wait a second, let's talk through this, right? Like what's like let's talk about the impact of this person's behavior, right? And so we talked about the impact. And then let's talk about how to deliver that feedback, right? So how do you deliver that feedback without being judgmental? Right? Because it's like you could say like, "Hey, you're being late," and that's really like you're like rude, you're disrespectful, you don't care about the team's time, and that's very that's making a lot of assumptions and accusing someone of the reasons for them being late, right? And so how do you frame that feedback in a way where it is merely observational, right? So, hey, you've been late to 3 stand-ups this week, and the impact to the team is that they cannot plan their work because they don't know what you're working on. They don't know if we're gonna, step on each other's toes. They don't know how they can help, right? I as a manager cannot communicate to the founders about, the status of a project and whether it's going to launch on time. So there's all these cascading impacts to you being late to stand-ups, for example, right? And that doesn't pass any judgment on why you were late, but this is what you being late does to myself and to the team, right? And then opening the dialogue, I think, for conversation is where a lot of first-time managers kind of fail to create space for, because then in that particular situation there were specific like personal and medical reasons for this person not being able to make a certain time. And after kind of discussing it, right, and after delivering the feedback in an objective way and discussing it with their employee, the team actually decided like, hey, we should actually just change the time of our stand-ups. And they did that. to be like an hour later, and this person showed up to stand-ups after that. And it like wasn't, it wasn't really a problem. There were still a couple things to iron out here and there, but ultimately it was like just the team making a small accommodation and adjustment for someone who is going through some personal things, through some medical issues, that then helped resolve the situation for the better. And we didn't have to fire someone and assume that they were just like a bad employee.
Totally. Yeah, that's a great example. It reminds me, I had a report at some point that was consistently late in the mornings. And it turned out that they had a disastrous situation going on at home that they were dealing with, and they just were out of their depth and they didn't know how to deal with it. And in fact, I had thought that as a manager, my job was to help them within the bounds of their work hours.
Hmm.
And as we started having this conversation, it turned out that the most effective thing I could do as a manager was help them strategize how they were going to deal with this home situation.
Right.
And they were open to it. Right. And
Right.
that's always a challenge when you're bridging boundaries, right? You have to say, like,
Absolutely.
I am here to support you. If you want support in these things outside of work, you can bring those to me.
Right.
If you do not wish to, if you want to keep a very firm boundary there, that's fine too. Right.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely. And then you have to then walk that line of, and I'm also not your therapist, but I can help you
totally,
process, right? But I'm not here to, like help you work through, your internal demons or whatnot. And so there's definitely that as well. And I think that's another hard thing for like first time managers to navigate, right? It's like how much do I offer, how much do I support, where then it starts to blur a little bit and maybe be a little bit unhealthy, right? Then you can create like these codependent situations, which are not good either.
totally. Do you have an approach that you take or that you teach for that?
Um, hmm. I don't think that I do have anything concrete there other than for managers to make sure they're taking the time to reflect on their one-on-one conversations, right? And to think about whether those conversations are crossing a personal boundary for them, right? Because I think everyone's threshold for that will also depend. And I would say, me, for example, I personally probably go more out of my way than I should a lot of the times, but I also don't mind doing it, right? Whereas some folks might just be like, my boundary is a little bit, more in that direction, and that's where I draw the line. And so it's more like, as a manager, where's your level of comfort of how involved you want to get with someone, and helping them navigate potential personal situations that are seeping into work, because ultimately you can't really separate those things, right? You as a person and a human, like you're going to show up to work how you show up, and a lot of that is influenced by what happens in personal life. So in any case, making sure that managers are reflecting for themselves and making sure they're comfortable with how their conversations are going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes back to a theme that's been going through this, right? Of being aware and being explicit and
Yeah,
being, willing to have those conversations and say, hey, like, I'm here to support you and I am not your therapist. And now that we're talking about, your depression or your anxiety or wherever it's going, like, it's pushing my line. Maybe you should go and talk to a therapist about it.
exactly, exactly. And I know that, because for myself, especially as someone who has ADHD, right? It's like, for me, I think one of the reasons why I am more willing to kind of like go there and like push that boundary a little bit, right, is because I have had to learn a lot of these lessons the hard way, right? And so if me sharing or me helping someone think through that problem for themselves, who, might may or may not have sort of like a, similar challenges, right? I think is like, if I can help someone avoid that pain and those mistakes, then I am more than happy to, right? And then once I start getting out of my depth of like, whoa, okay, that's like a mommy issue or a daddy issue, and I cannot help you with that one. But like if it comes to down to things like anxiety and like neurodiversity and how that shows up at work, that definitely is, I feel like, within my ball house and my interest to actually help people navigate.
Totally. And one of the challenging things with these is that all of these pieces that we talk about are spectrums that go on in every human being, right?
Hmm.
Depression is something that everyone experiences things along the spectrum towards depression
Yeah.
based on situations. And for some people, it is becomes so disruptive to their life that it becomes a psychological disorder, and it's
Yes.
something that needs to be treated by a
Yes.
mental health professional. Um, Similarly, I think a lot of people have different amounts of focus abilities. There's a whole spectrum there, and you might be all the way to clinically ADHD, or you might be partway along the way, but it's about
Right.
how your brain works. And so, as we as managers are interacting with folks, you know, there is no hard and fast line. Where is this? Where is it not? We just
Yes.
need to, as you highlight, just keep reassessing and put our own boundaries in place.
Yes. And I think the other thing too is to consider that from an organizational standpoint, right? I definitely have been in orgs before that are maybe less, I would say maybe like less open or something, right? Like less open or less able to investigate these things as an organization, right? So I think that's the other thing as a manager you have to keep in mind is like, is my org ready to have, like a conversation about anxiety, how that shows up at work, anxiety accommodations, and like some teams are ready to talk about that, and some teams are maybe so far sort of like ingrained in their belief systems or their biases that it would be really difficult to kind of like break that thought pattern because it's like a potentially like multiple people that you would have to do that work with. And so, one of the lessons I had to learn earlier on in my career, because I also have that strong sense of, fairness and justice myself, right, is that there are some orgs that are just not ready to have certain conversations. And that's okay. And for yourself, you have to make that choice of, am I okay working here and potentially reinforcing some of these behaviors that are maybe not so welcoming or not so inclusive, knowing that the org is not there yet, or do I want to go find another opportunity that better aligns with my values, my sense of like fairness and justice and all of that, right? So that is like definitely a thing where I've definitely like burned a couple bridges in my past too of just pushing too hard when leaders or other folks in the org were not like ready to have some of those conversations.
Totally. Well, I think that's one thing that is important as we talk about these, bigger cultural questions and how we deal with justice and equity and mental health is like we it's easy for people who care about these issues to burn themselves out
Yeah.
pushing in an environment where there isn't receptivity. And like it is completely completely legitimate to say, hey, you know what, I need this job for some other reason,
Right.
and it is not where I would like it to be in all of these dimensions, but I cannot myself invest in fixing it.
Right. Right. And that is something that often falls on the on the whoever that minority is, and on whatever sort of like vector of isms that you want to sort of like bring forward there, right? But basically, it's always falls on, or often, not always, but often falls on, the person who is minoritized, right, to
Totally.
fix that problem. Which it's like sometimes, like no, maybe sometimes you just don't have the capacity for it, and that's okay too, right?
Yeah,
And so you do the work when you're able to, or until you are unable to, I don't know, to put up with it for more.
totally. Well, and I think, people sometimes get trapped. An example that's very present in my mind right now is looking at what happened to Twitter, now X, and the people working there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who, for visa reasons, end up
Yeah.
trapped there, even though the environment is no longer one they wish to work at.
Yes. Right.
And like they may or may not be able to get out of that situation. So
Right.
like I think it's easy to judge when you are in
Yes.
a place of whatever form of privilege it might be to, move or whatever. Like not everyone has that.
Absolutely.
Um, anyway, we've kind of gotten off a ways, but I realized that we are close to the end of our time. And I want to make sure, are there any other topics that you would like to cover while we have this time together before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. I mean, these are all we've already talked about all the things that I love talking about. So, no, I think I'm good.
Okay, cool. Well, I am going to ask one closing question, which is, you know, thinking back about, so we talked about values and we talked about corporate values and we talked about how those play out. And we just now have sort of been talking a lot about something that is also very values related. Like, how do you show up at work? How much do you push? How much do you not? A question I want to ask you is, how do you think about, or how did you come to your personal values and how you want to show up at work?
Ooh, great question. A lot of that comes from my own personal experiences, right? Professionally, there was the whole growth at all costs, right? In my early career, that just I burnt out multiple times early in my career. So there was like that really influenced a lot of the values that I hold now. But there was also the fact that I was often the only woman on the team, right? I was on a team where there were more people named Dave than there were women on the team. Um, and then I had a child, so then I was also often the only mother on the team. And then oftentimes the only Asian person on the team. And so just being, I think, in these situations where I have been part of the group of others for so long, but then also having to figure out how to fit in, right? And how a lot of that just felt very inauthentic to me, but I did it, in some ways for like that survival and to like gain the credibility and the respect and to do in order to do my job, right? Had to fit in. And so I think all of those experiences are really what led me to where I'm at now in terms of valuing, like valuing people, valuing trust, and then just wanting to, and then knowing that there's other ways to build an organization that do not require all these things that generally happen in the startup world, right? Because I've had that experience, like a positive experience at a company that was not a startup, and it was like a healthy one, and people were able to be vulnerable with each other and to have hard conversations and make hard business decisions and favor people over profits, right? And so knowing that there are successful businesses, however small, that can do that, just means that in tech and startups that we just haven't figured out how to scale that yet. And so that's where my values come from. That's what I'm like trying to prove in the work that I'm doing.
All right, that's it for this Human Skills interview. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. You can also subscribe to the Human Skills newsletter, which there's a link to right down below, to get notified of interviews like this as they come out. Take care, y'all. This is K-Ball signing out.